I don't do a whole lot in the way of gear reviews and opinions, but I figured I really needed to do one for the Gearlab Outdoors IPIK 225, which is their latest paddle. And for a couple reasons. One, to say thank you to Gearlab Outdoors for actually sending me this paddle to do some testing and play with it. I appreciate that trust and respect from you guys. But also because I am so, I guess, in love with, for lack of a better phrase, my Kalleq. And it's become the paddle I will reach for before anything else, regardless of the conditions I'm paddling in. And the more I've used this over the past couple of weeks, almost a month I think at this point, in a variety of conditions and ways, from simply rolling on a flat water warm lake to playing in Deception Pass at 4 knots of current and tide race surfing, to being out in wind, to just some flat water paddles. I actually find myself reaching for this paddle, or not disliking reaching for this paddle. And so I wanted to go through and figure out what the differences were in terms of not just what changes have been made by Gearlab with respect to the paddle, but also what I'm feeling that's very different from the original IPIK. So I'll take a couple of basic things to start. And obviously the length is longer. This is 225 centimeters versus the original 219. Gearlab has made some changes to the material and the weave, which would ideally make this paddle stronger. But that's not much I can speak to because I really have never had an issue with strength on the original. It's just never been a problem for me, but I know it has for some. The paddle isn't per se lighter by comparison to the original. They're actually the same weight, but when you consider that this paddle is 6 centimeters longer, that would actually make the paddle lighter at the same length. Not by much, not something I really notice, but for some people that will be important. Where I find the most significant changes are, and the ones that actually, for that matter, have the biggest impact on paddling, center around the loom and the blade itself. So one big thing on the loom is that this loom, while still traditionally longer than we would expect for the paddle length, is actually more in line with Gearlab's other paddles. That's to say that the loom length on the original IPIK 219 centimeters was 57 centimeters long. That was the same loom length as the 230 Kalleq, which means a significantly shorter paddle with the same loom length. The original Kalleq 220 has a 55 cm loom length. So even for a 1 centimeter longer paddle, the loom on the Kalleq is 2 centimeters shorter than the original IPIK, which doesn't seem like a lot, but it was very noticeable when I was paddling it. And it sort of felt awkward, and yet I didn't find the 57 cm loom length awkward on the 230 Kalleq. I just found it a little less natural for me to paddle that long length of paddle. So interestingly, on the IPIK 225 that I'm using, that loom length remained at 57 cm, the same as the original IPIK, even though this paddle blade, or overall paddle length, I should say, is 6 centimeters longer. That also means that this paddle length is 5 centimeters shorter than the long Kalleq with the same length. Maybe not such a stark difference, and maybe not enough to affect performance, but I find the loom length still a bit longer than I'd prefer, 53 to 54 with a modern sea kayak with 22 to 23 inch beams, since really works for me. But obviously on a longer paddle that's not going to work commercially. But the 57 cm paddle is not, loom length, sorry, is not uncomfortable with the longer paddle. I did, however, find it uncomfortable with the much shorter paddle. Hard to say why, but I think some of that has to do with my hand position relative to my shoulders and my hull, and just how much of that blade I'm getting in the water. So the stroke just was very unnatural for me, whereas at least with the 225 cm paddle, I can get to a more natural stroke. At least by far, it's still not my best stroke. And part of that's also due to the fact that I'm paddling up against a couple of knots of current right now in the Tacoma Narrows, just to give you an idea what you can do with the paddle with very little effort, but still not perfect. So we have a major change in loom length relative to the paddle length. The other big change in loom length and the loom itself is, at least from information I've gotten from Gearlab, the loom is a bit smaller, so it still retains that oval shape, but not as pronounced. So this morning, just out of curiosity, because it has felt smaller, it felt more comfortable in my hand, I compared it to the original. I don't personally see the difference, so mine may have been slightly adjusted from the original IPIK that I have, and one of the early production ones, but hard to say, so I'm just going to take Gearlab's word for that one. It does, however, feel more comfortable on hands, and I have smaller hands, so that could be part of it. It's just a feel thing, and it could also be relative to how it holds the loom, because that loom length is a little more natural for me given the paddle's length. Hard to say, but it does feel better in the hands. What I do notice, and one of the reasons why I love the Kalleq so much is with that round loom, is that there's a big improvement now on this oval compared to the original one. And where I feel it most is when I start getting into draw strokes, cross bow rudders, bow jams, linked and blended strokes, where I'm actually maneuvering that paddle through the water for control and to get the kayak to dance a little bit, rather than just forward strokes. So the one thing about a oval loom is it really does help a newer paddler, somebody less familiar with greenland paddles, get that canted angle a little more dialed in early on, because it promotes the hand position on the paddle to align the knuckles at the top of the blade and the palm flat on the blade itself. But at the same time, in any sort of advanced strokes with blended maneuvers, I find it does change the contact patch on my hand. I don't feel that as much on this paddle as I did on the original. And so what do I mean by all that? So when I teach paddling, well, step back here. What I see most paddlers do when they do something like a draw stroke is that they're going to turn around and rotate their wrists back. You see my wrist is rotated back, which creates either my rudder or my draw. And that allows me to hold my position and my hand grip on the loom exactly where it would be for my forward stroke. Easy transition. The problem for me is that this puts my wrists in a weak spot. They're bent back. I have a little less control because that joint is now somewhat compromised. And I don't get the same power or pressure on the blade that I would if I kept my hands in a more neutral position. What I teach and how obviously I paddle is a more neutral hand position. That my wrist won't bend open or bend back, but my hand will open up. I now keep my wrist as straight in line all the way down, neutral, with my elbow and my shoulder, and I have a lot more control over the paddle that way. and I have a lot more strength behind whatever maneuver I'm doing. It's effortless now in my body. There's no forces acting on my wrist in any way, shape, or form. Again, this is not a perfect stroke because I'm looking at the camera, not where I'm going, and not focused so much on technique as I am just the ability to move the blade. The problem when doing a draw stroke this way, or any sort of, let's say, high brace turn, is that you can see when I rotate my hand this way, so I'm going to get the camera angle on, my thumb and index finger are wrapped around the loom, and right now at the shoulder, and there's contact all the way around. As soon as I loosen this blade in my hand, and I paddle with a very loose grip that allows me to rotate the blade to keep my hand neutral as I move into a stroke, the oval goes from being around the narrow part to being around the wider part. And what that does, it's hard to see here, but it opens up a gap between my hand and the paddle. So I don't have the same contact patch as I do when my hand is around the loom completely. So for a forward stroke, I've got great contact on it and very good canted angle position and indexing. But as soon as I rotate this blade to keep my wrist neutral for more control and power or efficiency in my stroke, I actually take my hand somewhat off the paddle, and now I have two pinch points rather than constant feedback and pressure evenly around my fingers. That means that when the paddle's in the water, it does slip a little bit back and forth. If you watch really carefully, my paddle does sort of rock back and forth ever so slightly when I have an oval loom in my hand. That is not the case when I have a round loom in my hand. So, where there's a difference between the 225 that I'm using now and the original, well, it does feel like the loom is less pronounced, even if it's not smaller. That I find less slip using the IPIK 225 than I ever did with the 219. It's just much smoother. Not as good as the Kalleq in my opinion, but still pretty close, and I don't feel like I'm losing much. Very slight adjustment on my fingers that allows me to keep a very loose grip but still maintain the control I want. And I always had a problem with that with the original IPIK. And it really showed doing things like hanging draws, which are not and have not been a problem with this paddle. So definitely a big improvement on that. That loom also, and that less pronounced, has another side benefit, and that benefit there is that the transition from the loom to the paddle itself feels a little smoother than on the original one. That means if I am sliding my hand out to extend the paddle to do a roll, I don't feel this shift from loom to blade as much as I did on the original IPIK. So if you do for rolling or for sliding strokes, if you do them, that's a whole separate conversation. But even just if I have my hand and I just want to slide my hand slightly down, right, on this paddle, my hand, when I do my draw, is actually now on the blade to help compensate a little bit for that change in contact patch. It's a very smooth transition, and I really don't lose control. Again, never felt that way with the original IPIK, and it was one reason I generally didn't paddle with it. This feels much closer and much more in control, and more like my Kalleq. I still find the Kalleq a little better in extremely rough water, but again, having paddled this in a tide race and doing rescues with it while it's in my hands and maneuvering and everything else, I really didn't have any negative feelings for this paddle. I actually started to become, again, quite enamored with it, and so like I said, it's a paddle I now reach for, where I would always reach for the Kalleq the last time, or previously. The other thing about this loom that is a bit different than the original, it still retains that oval shape, but unlike the original, the inside of this loom has been changed. So it's got a round inset in it. And for me, that does a couple of things. The one big challenge that I really had with the original was that the paddle would stick, especially when taking it apart. And I am horrible when it comes to doing any sort of gear maintenance, in that I'm on the water sometimes 5, 6, 7 days a week most of the year. So taking the time to wash everything the way it should be just doesn't always happen, doesn't usually happen. So I found I tended to have the paddle stick and be harder to disassemble. And I find with the round loom inset in there, it is just so much easier at the end of the day. I mean, it's apart. There's no tight twisting or anything else. And I don't feel, right, any slop when the paddle's together. There is no rotation on this. It's nice and tight in there. So I'm not giving up some of that stiffness in the joint to hold it from any sort of rotation or twist by going into that inset. The other thing that I see that inset having value of is that a few paddlers have mentioned that they feel like there's either flex up when they're rolling, especially some paddlers with a reverse sweep. I know a few that have broken the original IPIK at the joint. There is a lot of pressure on certain rolls, just natural pressure. And if you do muscle the roll a little bit more than you should, that puts extra pressure on the paddle. Having that round inset within the oval loom will definitely strengthen this paddle and make it much harder for the loom to break. So to me, bonus. I think the fact that the paddle goes together easier, comes apart easier, that inset makes a significant difference. We keep the oval loom, we get the benefit of the easy assembly and disassembly of a round loom. And with the change in slight shape and size in the loom, according to Gearlab, I'm not finding I lose as much control as I used to with the original. The other big piece that I found changed on the IPIK on the 225 is the edge of the paddle. This is really sharp. This is almost knife-edged. It is sharper than the original for sure. It is definitely sharper than the Kalleq. One of the things I found that on really flat water, especially when you can see it, that paddle will go into the water with very little disturbance, slice through, and come out with very little disturbance. It really is a nice slicing through the water. That does a couple things. Obviously, it increases efficiency if the paddle is not creating as much disturbance, if it's knifing in easier. The stroke is just so much smoother and efficient. I actually find the stroke on this a bit more enjoyable than I do find it on the Kalleq sometimes. Again, part of why I reach for this paddle now. The other thing, and I don't know if it is a function of the sharpness of the blade, the change in transition from loom to blade, or a combination. But one of the things that used to bother me with the original IPIK was that it makes a hollow vibration, echoey sound as it moves through the water. So a good Greenland stroke, even at cruising speed, is virtually silent. And so on a calm day like this, I can simply just sit and listen to nature. I become one with my environment. And on days where it's just me out here and there's nobody on shore, there's no boats passing, except out in the distance, it is just nice to be out here and not hear it's nice to be out here and just not hear my paddle. So I don't know what brought about that change in sound, but whatever it is, not having that bit of annoyance when I'm in this kind of environment where I'm just out with my thoughts and just enjoying nature has just been huge in terms of enjoyment in using the paddle. So overall, there have been a number of nice changes, significant upgrades, I would say, to the Kalleq. The adjustment of the Loom length relative to paddle length, much more comfortable, much more natural. The added inset in the Loom, easier to take apart, easier to assemble without any fighting with it. Probably does add a good degree of strength and structural integrity to the Loom of the paddle. That should address some issues people are having. The knife edge, this paddle just effortlessly cuts through the water, even better, like I said, than my Kalleq. And whatever change was really done to the shape of the Loom, even though I can't really see it between the two paddles, I can feel it. Much smoother transition to the blade itself from the Loom, making sliding strokes or rolling maneuver with an extended paddle much more comfortable. And just overall, I'm not feeling like I lose my contact patch for more advanced strokes and maneuvering as I did on the Kalleq, sorry, on the original IPIK. So in terms of use and thoughts on paddles, I still absolutely love my Kalleq. In rough water, absolutely, it is going to be my go-to paddle. If I'm just out cruising, yeah, I have found myself reaching for this paddle, and I will continue to reach for this paddle. I am really looking forward to getting a shorter one, because at that point, I would be hard-pressed sometimes to want my Kalleq unless I'm in those big dynamic conditions. And then at least I know with this paddle, trust this paddle, that even if I wind up in those dynamic environments, or I want to do some maneuvers and play and have some fun with the kayak, even on a paddle like this, I can do that without feeling like I'm fighting the paddle. That the paddle still does what I ask of it and still provides me the feedback I expect from it. So all in all, the IPIK 225 has really grown on me, and I am really enjoying paddling with it, and it's definitely worth taking some time to get to know it. So obviously you're in my area, this paddle's available for you to play with and demo. It has already been out. But yeah, if you're thinking about the original IPIK and the length of this paddle isn't going to be a problem for you, being a bit longer, absolutely worth it.